The transport ship lurched violently as it docked at San Francisco Harbor. Emiko Tanaka pressed her back against the cold metal wall, her hands trembling. Around her, dozens of Japanese women prisoners huddled together in the darkness of the cargo hold. They had been told stories, terrible stories about what Americans did to prisoners. Torture, starvation, execution. Chio Yamamoto, the eldest among them, gripped Emiko's hand tightly and whispered words that made everyone's blood run cold. This must be a trick. Everything they were about to see, everything they were about to experience would challenge everything they believed about their enemy, because nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for what was waiting on the other side of that door. The heavy steel door groaned open, flooding the hold with blinding California sunlight. Emiko shielded her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had been a military nurse in the Pacific, captured during the fall of Saipan 6 months earlier. 6 months of cramped conditions, minimal food, and constant fear. She expected the worst was yet to come. Chio stepped forward first, her shoulders squared despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her weathered face. At 45, she had been a school teacher in Tokyo before the war consumed everything. Now she was just another prisoner, another enemy to be dealt with. She had watched younger women break under the weight of captivity, and she had sworn to herself that she would remain strong, remain dignified, no matter what awaited them. Behind Chio, Haruko Sato trembled so violently that Emiko wrapped an arm around the young woman's shoulders. At 22, Haruko had lost her entire family in the bombing of their village. She had volunteered as a factory worker, then found herself caught in the chaos of the war's final months. Her eyes, once bright with youth, now held only shadows and fear. American voices barked orders outside. Emiko braced herself. This was it. This was where the real suffering would begin. She had heard the propaganda broadcasts, the warnings about American savagery. She had seen the posters depicting Americans as demons with no mercy, no humanity. Lieutenant Margaret Hayes stood on the dock, clipboard in hand, watching as the Japanese women prisoners emerged from the ship. She had been briefed on their condition, emaciated, traumatized, expecting execution at any moment. Her orders were clear: treat them with dignity, provide medical care, process them according to the Geneva Convention. But looking at their faces, hollow with fear and resignation, she felt something twist in her chest. These were not soldiers. These were nurses, teachers, civilians caught in the machinery of war. Beside her, Corporal James Wilson shifted his weight nervously. As a Japanese-American soldier, he occupied a strange space in this conflict. His parents had been interned in Manzanar while he fought for America in Europe. Now he was here, tasked with translating between two worlds that had tried to destroy each other. He watched as the first woman, older and dignified despite her ragged clothes, descended the gangplank with careful steps. Chio's feet touched American soil. She waited for the blow, the shouted curse, the rifle butt to her ribs. Instead, Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward and spoke in a calm, measured tone. Corporal Wilson translated, "Welcome to the United States. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with dignity and respect. We will provide medical care, food, and shelter. You are safe now." Chio stared at the American officer, searching for the lie, the cruel joke. There had to be a catch. This was propaganda, a performance before the real torture began. She turned to the women behind her and spoke in rapid Japanese. "Do not believe anything they say. This is a trick. They want us to relax, to trust them, so the punishment will hurt more. Stay alert. Stay together." Emiko descended next, her medical training allowing her to assess the situation with clinical detachment. The American soldiers surrounding them held rifles, but the weapons were not pointed at the prisoners. Their expressions were not cruel or mocking. They looked professional, almost bored. This made no sense. Every piece of propaganda, every warning from their commanders, had painted Americans as ruthless barbarians who would show no mercy. Haruko stumbled on the gangplank, her legs weak from months of poor nutrition. Instantly, an American soldier stepped forward to steady her. She flinched violently, expecting a blow. Instead, the young man, barely older than herself, offered his hand to help her down. His face showed concern, not hatred. She recoiled from his touch, stumbling backward into Emiko. The translator quickly explained that the soldier was only trying to help. Haruko's eyes filled with tears. Nothing was making sense. The world had turned upside down. They were herded, gently, surprisingly gently toward a row of buses. Emiko expected cattle trucks, cramped cages, the kind of transport suitable for animals. Instead, they were directed to actual passenger buses, with seats and windows. Chio hesitated at the door, suspicion etched into every feature. "Where are you taking us?" Lieutenant Hayes, through the translator, explained that they were being transported to a processing facility where they would receive medical examinations, clean clothes, and food. Chio's expression hardened. She climbed aboard the bus, her mind racing through possibilities. Perhaps the processing facility was a euphemism for something darker. Perhaps the real horror awaited them there. The bus ride took them through San Francisco streets. The women pressed their faces to the windows, staring in shocked silence at the world outside. The city was intact. Buildings stood tall and undamaged. People walked the streets freely, going about their daily lives. Cars filled the roads. Shop windows displayed goods. Children played in parks. Emiko felt her understanding of reality crack and shift. They had been told that America was on the brink of collapse, that the war had devastated their economy and infrastructure, that their people were starving and desperate. But this was a city thriving in the middle of a war. How was this possible? A young woman on the sidewalk pushed a baby carriage, laughing at something her companion said. Haruko watched this simple scene with something like hunger in her eyes. Normal life. People living without fear. It seemed like a fantasy, a cruel mirage. The bus turned down a tree-lined street and pulled up to a large building that had once been a school. American flags hung from poles, and military personnel moved with purposeful efficiency around the grounds. The women were ushered off the buses and into a large hall that had been converted into a processing center. Long tables were set up with American military personnel seated behind them. But what caught everyone's attention was the smell. Food. Real food. Hot food. The aroma of soup and bread filled the air, and despite themselves, despite their fear and suspicion, every stomach in the group responded with desperate hunger. Lieutenant Hayes directed them toward the tables where medical personnel waited. Each woman would be examined, their health assessed, any immediate needs addressed. Emiko, as a nurse herself, understood the logic of this, but she also knew that medical experiments had been conducted in the name of war. What if this was another form of cruelty disguised as care? When her turn came, she approached the table where an American nurse sat with forms and a stethoscope. The woman looked up and smiled. It was not a cruel smile or a mocking one. It was simply kind. "Hello, I'm Nurse Campbell. I'm going to do a basic health check. Is that all right?" The translator conveyed the message. Emiko nodded stiffly, preparing herself for pain. Instead, Nurse Campbell's examination was gentle and professional. She checked Emiko's pulse, listened to her heart and lungs, examined her eyes and throat. She noted the signs of malnutrition and dehydration with concern, not disgust. "You've lost a lot of weight. When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Emiko couldn't answer. She didn't trust her voice. The gentleness of the stranger's touch, the genuine concern in her eyes. It was breaking something inside her that she had built carefully to survive. After the examination, they were directed to another area where clothes were distributed. Clean clothes. Not rags or cast-offs, but actual garments in various sizes. The women were shown to shower facilities, real showers with hot water and soap. Chio stood at the entrance to the shower room, her suspicion reaching new heights. This is where it happens. This is where they gas us, like we heard they do to prisoners. But there was no gas. There was only hot water cascading from the shower heads, washing away months of grime and despair. Emiko stood under the spray, letting it soak through her hair and run down her face, mixing with tears she didn't even realize she was crying. The water was hot. They were wasting hot water on prisoners. It made no sense. Clean and dressed in fresh clothes, they were led to a dining hall. Tables were set with trays of food, soup, bread, vegetables, even small portions of meat. It was more food than Emiko had seen in months. The women stood frozen, staring at the trays. "Please, sit and eat. You must be hungry." Lieutenant Hayes gestured to the tables. Still, no one moved. Chio's mind worked frantically. The food must be poisoned, or perhaps they would eat. and then the Americans would laugh and take it away. A final psychological torture before execution. She turned to the other women. Do not touch the food. It is poisoned. Lieutenant Hayes, sensing their fear through the translator, did something unexpected. She picked up a tray, took a spoon, and ate a full bite of the soup in front of them. Then she broke off a piece of bread and ate that too. She smiled. See? It's safe. It's just food. Please eat. Haruko's stomach overrode her mind. She stumbled forward, grabbed a tray, and began eating with desperate, gulping motions. Within moments, the other women followed. Emiko ate slowly, methodically, her nurse's training warning her that eating too much too quickly after starvation could be dangerous. But the taste, the simple taste of warm soup and fresh bread, was overwhelming. Chio ate last, each bite calculated, waiting for the poison to take effect, for the trick to reveal itself. But nothing happened. The food was just food, and it kept coming. When trays were empty, more were brought. No one was denied. No one was mocked for their hunger. As the sun set outside, the women were shown to sleeping quarters. Not cells, not cages. Actual rooms with cots, thin mattresses, and blankets. Each woman received her own cot. Privacy, even in captivity. Emiko lay down on her assigned cot and stared at the ceiling, her mind unable to process the day's events. Beside her, Haruko whispered in the darkness, Emiko-san, why are they being kind to us? Emiko had no answer. Everything she had been taught, everything she had believed about the enemy was unraveling. The Americans were supposed to be monsters, but monsters did not provide hot showers and warm food. Monsters did not check your health with gentle hands and concerned faces. Chio's voice cut through the darkness, hard and certain. Do not let your guard down. This is psychological warfare. They are softening us up before the real interrogation begins. They want us confused and grateful so we will betray our country. Stay strong. Remember who we are. But even as she spoke those words, Chio felt doubt creeping into her heart. She had been so certain of what awaited them. She had prepared herself for torture and death. Instead, she had received the most basic human dignities, things she had not experienced in months. It was disorienting, like drowning in reverse, being pulled up into air when you had accepted the water. The next morning, they were awakened not by shouting or violence, but by the smell of breakfast cooking. Porridge with sugar, toast with butter, coffee, real coffee. The women ate in stunned silence, waiting for the other shoe to drop. After breakfast, Lieutenant Hayes addressed the group through Corporal Wilson. Today, you will meet with Red Cross representatives. They will document your names and status so that your families can be notified that you are alive and well. You will also have the opportunity to write letters home. This announcement caused a ripple of shock through the assembled prisoners. Write letters home? Notify families? This had to be the trap. They would write the letters, reveal information about their loved ones, and then the Americans would use that information as leverage or worse. But when the Red Cross representatives arrived, they were not military personnel. They were civilians, men and women who spoke gently and moved without threat. They carefully recorded each woman's name, age, hometown, and any family information they were willing to share. They explained that under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war had the right to communicate with their families. Emiko sat across from a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair. The Red Cross worker smiled encouragingly. What is your name, dear? Emiko Tanaka. And where are you from, Emiko? Tokyo. I was a nurse. The woman wrote carefully, her expression neutral and professional. Then she slid a piece of paper and a pencil across the table. Would you like to write to your family? Let them know you are safe? Emiko stared at the paper. Safe. That word again. Was she safe? After everything that had happened, was she truly safe? Her hands trembled as she picked up the pencil. What could she possibly write? How could she explain any of this? She wrote simply, I am alive. I am being treated well. Do not worry. Your daughter, Emiko. As she folded the letter, she wondered if it would ever reach her parents in Tokyo. She wondered if they even survived the bombings. She wondered if this letter was just another elaborate lie. The days began to blur together in a surreal pattern. Each morning brought food. Each day brought small kindnesses that chipped away at their certainty. Medical staff checked on those who were ill, providing medicine and treatment. No one was beaten. No one was tortured. No interrogations took place beyond the basic documentation of their identities. Haruko began to smile again, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. She made friends with one of the young American nurses who showed her pictures of her family back in Ohio. The nurse taught her a few English words. Hello, thank you, beautiful. Simple words that bridged an impossible gap. Emiko watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Part of her wanted to warn Haruko, to remind her that these people were still the enemy. But another part of her, the part that had dreamed of being a healer rather than a soldier, recognized something profound in these small acts of humanity. Chio remained resistant, her suspicion a armor she refused to remove. She watched everything with sharp eyes, looking for the crack in the facade, the moment when the Americans would reveal their true nature. But as weeks passed, that moment never came. One afternoon, Lieutenant Hayes arranged for the women to spend time outside in a courtyard area. Fresh air, sunshine, the freedom to walk around within the boundaries of the facility. It was not freedom, but it was not cruelty either. It was something in between, something Chio had not anticipated. She found herself standing beside Emiko, both women watching as younger prisoners played a simple game with a ball some American soldier had provided. Their laughter, genuine laughter, echoed off the walls. I do not understand this. Chio spoke quietly, almost to herself. We were told they were demons. We were told they would destroy us. Emiko turned to look at the older woman, seeing the confusion and pain in her eyes. Perhaps we were lied to. Perhaps they were lied to as well. Perhaps war makes everyone believe terrible things about each other so we can justify the killing. Chio's face hardened. That is dangerous thinking. That kind of thinking makes you a traitor. Or maybe it just makes you human. The words hung between them. Chio wanted to argue, to reassert the certainties that had guided her through this nightmare. But those certainties were crumbling, and she did not know what would replace them. That evening, something extraordinary happened. Corporal Wilson approached the group with a record player and a small collection of records. Through translation, he explained that music was permitted during evening hours if they wished. He showed them the selection, some American jazz, some classical pieces, even a few Japanese recordings that had been approved. The women gathered around as the first notes of a traditional Japanese melody filled the air. Haruko closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. It was a song her mother used to sing, a lullaby from childhood. In this strange place, surrounded by enemies who fed them and clothed them and now played them music from home, she felt something break open inside her chest. Emiko moved to sit beside Haruko, taking the young woman's hand. They did not speak. They simply listened as the music carried them across an ocean and back to a time before war, before fear, before everything shattered. Lieutenant Hayes watched from the doorway, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. She thought about her brother, killed at Guadalcanal. She thought about the hatred she had felt when she received that telegram, the burning desire for revenge against every Japanese person who had contributed to his death. But looking at these women, these prisoners who had been so terrified of her, she could not find that hatred anymore. She found only exhaustion and a desperate wish for the war to end. Weeks turned into months. The women were gradually integrated into a more structured daily routine. They attended classes where they learned English and practical skills. They worked in the facility's gardens, growing vegetables that supplemented their meals. They received regular mail from the Red Cross, and some even received responses from families back in Japan. Emiko received a letter from her father. It was brief and carefully worded, clearly censored by Japanese authorities, but the message was clear. He was alive. Her mother was alive, and they were grateful to know she had survived. She held that letter like a treasure, reading it over and over until she had memorized every character. Haruko's transformation was the most dramatic. The terrified young woman who had stumbled off that ship was gone, replaced by someone who engaged with her surroundings, who asked questions, who dared to hope. She became particularly close with Nurse Campbell, who taught her basic medical skills. Haruko discovered a talent and passion for healing that gave her purpose. But it was Chio's transformation that perhaps meant the most. The older woman's resistance lasted the longest, her suspicion the deepest. She waited for the cruelty that never came. She searched for the hidden torture that did not exist. And slowly, painfully, she was forced to confront the possibility that she had been wrong. It happened on a rainy afternoon 3 months after their arrival. Chio was shelving books in the facility's small library when Lieutenant Hayes entered, looking troubled. Through the translator, she asked Chio to sit down. This was it, Chio thought. Finally, the truth. Instead, Lieutenant Hayes delivered news that shattered what remained of Chio's certainty. Her hometown had been bombed. The school where she had taught had been destroyed. Many people she knew were dead or missing. The Red Cross had confirmed the information. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Lieutenant Hayes said simply. "I know we are enemies. I know this war has taken so much from all of us. But I am still sorry." Chio stared at this American officer, this woman who represented everything she had been taught to hate. And in that moment, she saw not an enemy, but simply another person who understood loss, who had probably experienced her own grief in this terrible war. "Why?" Chio asked, her voice breaking. "Why are you kind to us? We are your enemies. Our people killed your people. Why do you not hate us?" Lieutenant Hayes was quiet for a long moment, searching for the right words. "Because you are not my enemies. Not you, not these women. You are prisoners. You are people. The governments went to war, not us, not individually. And I have seen enough death and suffering. I will not add to it if I have any choice." That night, Chio sat with Emiko and Haruko in their quarters. The rain drummed against the windows and the lights were low. For the first time since their capture, Chio spoke about her fears, her confusion, her slowly changing understanding of the world. "I was certain of everything. I knew who I was, who they were, what was right and wrong, but now I know nothing. They treat us with more kindness than our own military did. They see us as human beings, not tools or resources. How do I reconcile this with everything I was taught?" Emiko, ever practical, responded gently. "Maybe we cannot reconcile it. Maybe we just have to accept that the world is more complicated than we were told. Both sides have done terrible things. But these people, these Americans we have met, they are choosing not to be terrible to us. That has to mean something." Haruko added her own thoughts, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "I hated them. I hated all Americans for what happened to my family. But the Americans I have met here did not kill my family. They did not bomb my village. They are just trying to do their jobs with as much humanity as possible. I cannot hate them for that. I cannot hate people for being kind to me." The three women sat in silence, each processing their own journey from fear to confusion to something approaching understanding. They were still prisoners. The war was still raging. Their people were still dying. But in this small facility in California, something had shifted. A tiny crack had appeared in the wall of hatred and propaganda that separated two nations. The war in the Pacific ground on for more months. The prisoners followed the news through carefully censored broadcasts, watching as their homeland came under increasing pressure. They felt conflicted, torn between loyalty to Japan and the growing realization that this war would end in defeat. When news finally came of Japan's surrender in August, the reaction in the facility was complex. Some women wept with relief that the killing would stop. Others felt shame and despair at their nation's defeat. But all of them felt uncertainty about what would come next. Lieutenant Hayes gathered the prisoners to explain what would happen. They would be repatriated to Japan in stages as transportation became available. They would go home. The war was over. Emiko felt a strange mixture of emotions. She wanted to see her parents, to return to her homeland. But she had grown accustomed to this place, to these people who had defied every expectation. She had even learned to trust some of them. Going home meant returning to a Japan that had been devastated, transformed by defeat. It meant leaving behind the strange sanctuary she had found in captivity. Haruko was even more conflicted. She had no family to return to. Japan held only painful memories. But America, even as a prisoner, had offered her the first kindness she had experienced in years. She asked through the translator if there was any way she could stay, perhaps work as a nurse. The answer was complicated by immigration laws and post-war policies. But Lieutenant Hayes promised to help explore the possibilities. Chio prepared to return with quiet dignity. She would go back to Japan and help rebuild. She would teach again if schools still existed. She would carry with her a profoundly changed understanding of the world, one that would shape how she educated future generations. She would tell them about the Americans who treated prisoners with humanity, who chose kindness over cruelty, even in war. On the day of departure, the women boarded a ship that would take them across the Pacific. They stood on the deck as the American coast receded, many of them in tears. Lieutenant Hayes and Corporal Wilson were there to see them off, along with many of the staff who had cared for them during their captivity. Lieutenant Hayes approached Emiko, Chio, and Haruko one final time. She shook each of their hands, a gesture that would have been unthinkable months earlier. I hope you find peace in your homeland. I hope Japan rises from this tragedy and builds something better, and I hope you remember that not all of us were monsters, just as I will remember that not all of you were my enemies. Emiko found her voice, speaking in careful English she had learned. Thank you. For everything. For showing us we were wrong. For being human when you did not have to be. The ship pulled away from the dock. The women waved to the figures on shore, these Americans who had turned their understanding of the world upside down. They had arrived expecting death and found mercy. They had braced for torture and found care. They had been certain it was a trick, and in the end, perhaps it was. The cruelest trick of all. Not cruelty disguised as kindness, but genuine kindness that forced them to reconsider everything they had believed about their enemies. Chio stood at the railing watching America disappear into the distance. She thought about what she would tell people when she returned. Would they believe her? Would they think she had been brainwashed, or had become a traitor? How could she explain that their greatest enemy had treated them better than they had dared to hope? Emiko joined her at the railing. The two women stood in silence, companions forged in the strangest of circumstances. What will you do when you return? Chio asked. Emiko considered the question carefully. I will try to rebuild. I will be a nurse again if there are hospitals left. I will tell my parents I survived, because Americans gave me food and medicine. And perhaps someday, I will understand what all of this meant. And you, Chio-san? I will teach. If there are children left to teach, I will teach them. And I will tell them the truth, all of it. The war, the defeat, the propaganda, and yes, the unexpected mercy. They deserve to know that the world is complicated, that enemies can be human, that hatred is taught and can be unlearned. Haruko approached them, her face still showing traces of tears. I am scared to go back. Everything I knew is gone. Chio put a hand on the young woman's shoulder. Then we will build new things. All of us. Japan will need to be rebuilt from the ground up. It will be hard, perhaps harder than the war itself, but we survived this. We can survive anything. The three women stood together as the ship carried them toward an uncertain future. They had been prisoners, yes, but they had also been witnesses to something profound. They had seen that even in the midst of total war, humanity could survive. They had experienced firsthand that the enemy was capable of mercy, of following rules, of treating prisoners with basic dignity. This knowledge was both a gift and a burden. It meant acknowledging that their own side had lied to them, had filled their heads with dehumanizing propaganda to make them willing to fight and die. It meant accepting that the Americans they had been taught to hate were as complex and varied as their own people. Some were cruel, surely. Some had committed atrocities, certainly. But some, like Lieutenant Hayes and Nurse Campbell and Corporal Wilson, had chosen a different path. The ship journey took weeks. The women had time to talk, to process, to prepare for what awaited them in Japan. They knew it would be devastated. They knew food would be scarce and rebuilding would take years. They knew they would face questions about their time in American captivity, suspicion about whether they had collaborated or betrayed their country. But they also knew they carried something valuable, a truth that needed to be told. The truth that even enemies could choose mercy. The truth that propaganda and hatred could be overcome by direct human contact. The truth that the Geneva Convention actually meant something to some people, that laws and treaties were not just words, but principles that guided action. When the ship finally approached the Japanese coast, the women crowded the rails to see their homeland. What they saw shocked them anew. Devastation on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. Cities reduced to rubble, factories destroyed, infrastructure shattered. The proud nation they had left was brought to its knees. Emiko felt tears stream down her face. This was her home, and it was broken. But she had survived. And if she had survived the war, survived captivity, survived the complete inversion of everything she thought she knew, then she could survive this too. The disembarkation process was chaotic. Japanese officials, working under American occupation forces, processed the returning prisoners. There were questions, paperwork, medical checks. But there was also reunion. Emiko found her parents in the crowd, older and thinner but alive. They embraced, all three of them crying, unable to speak for long minutes. Chio had no one waiting for her. Most of her family had perished in the bombing of her hometown. But she squared her shoulders and walked into this new Japan with purpose. There would be children who needed teachers. There would be a future that needed builders. Haruko, too, faced an empty homecoming. But she was not the terrified girl who had boarded that transport ship months ago. She had discovered strength she did not know she possessed. She had found a calling in healing. She would find a way forward. In the weeks and months that followed, the three women built new lives in occupied Japan. Emiko worked in a hospital run by American military doctors, her experience in the California facility making her valuable as a bridge between cultures. She translated not just language but understanding, helping Japanese patients overcome their fear of American medical care. Chio reopened a school in the ruins of her hometown. She taught children who had known nothing but war about peace, about reconstruction, about the complexity of the world. And yes, she told them about her time as a prisoner in America, about the unexpected kindness that had challenged everything she believed. Haruko trained as a nurse under the guidance of American medical staff. She worked alongside former enemies, helping to heal the wounded nation. Her fluency in English and understanding of American culture made her invaluable during the occupation years. Years passed. Japan rebuilt with astonishing speed. The scars of war remained, but new structures rose from the rubble. Democracy took root in soil that had known only militarism. Trade replaced conquest. Peace became possible. Emiko married a doctor she worked with and had children. She raised them in a Japan that was profoundly different from the one she had known. She taught them English and told them stories about the war, carefully balanced stories that acknowledged suffering on all sides and celebrated the human capacity for mercy. Chio never married, dedicating her life to education. She became known as a passionate advocate for international understanding and peace education. She traveled, eventually even returning to America, meeting with former enemies who had become friends. She never forgot her time as a prisoner, but she also never let it define her. Instead, she used it to teach. Haruko found love with a Japanese-American man whose family had been interned during the war. They bonded over their complicated relationships with both nations, over the ways war had torn at their identities. Together, they built a medical clinic that served the poorest communities, a monument to healing in a nation still recovering from violence. The three women remained in contact throughout their lives, bound by their shared experience. They met annually on the anniversary of their arrival in San Francisco, sharing a meal and remembering those surreal first days when they had been certain they were marching toward death, and instead found humanity. On one of these anniversaries, decades after the war, they received a letter. It was from Lieutenant Margaret Hayes, now retired and living in Oregon. She wrote about her life after the war, her own struggles with trauma and memory, her work with veterans organizations. But mostly she wrote to thank them. You taught me something important during those months in California. You taught me that the enemy is only the enemy until you see them as individuals. Once you see the person, once you acknowledge their humanity, everything changes. You were not Japanese prisoners to me. You were Emiko, Chio, Haruko. You were people with stories and families and dreams. That lesson has guided me ever since. I hope you found peace in your homeland. I hope the world my generation broke has been somewhat repaired by the ones that followed. Thank you for your grace during an impossible time. The three women read this letter together, tears in their aged eyes. They wrote back, a joint response that expressed gratitude and forgiveness and hope. They wrote about Japan's transformation, about the next generation growing up in peace, about the value of remembering history honestly so it would not repeat. Emiko reflected on that first day often as she grew older. The terror, the confusion, the gradual dawning realization that everything they had been told was a lie. Not that Americans were incapable of cruelty. War had proven all nations capable of terrible things, but that Americans were just as capable of mercy, of following principles, of seeing prisoners as human beings deserving of basic dignity. That realization had been shocking, disorienting, even frightening in its implications. If the enemy was not a demon but simply another person, if they were capable of kindness and cruelty in equal measure, then what did that say about the nature of war itself? It meant that war was not a simple conflict of good versus evil, but a tragedy in which ordinary people were convinced to hate and kill other ordinary people. Chio used this lesson as the foundation of her teaching philosophy. She pushed her students to question, to seek truth beyond propaganda, to recognize humanity in all people regardless of nationality. She was sometimes criticized for this approach, accused of being unpatriotic or of betraying Japanese values. But she persisted, believing that the next generation deserved better than the lies her generation had been fed. Haruko found healing in her work. Each patient treated a small act of redemption. She had survived atrocities and mercy in equal measure. She had learned that individual choices mattered, that even in systems of violence and oppression, people could choose kindness. She modeled this in her practice, treating every patient with dignity, regardless of their ability to pay or their social status. As the three women entered their final years, they became historians of a sort, giving interviews about their experiences for universities and documentary filmmakers. They spoke honestly about the complexity of their feelings, the confusion of those first days, the slow transformation of understanding. They talked about how propaganda had shaped their expectations, how they had been taught to fear torture and death from American captors. They talked about the shock of receiving food and medical care instead. They talked about the gradual, painful process of accepting that they had been lied to by their own government about the nature of the enemy. But they also talked about resilience, about the human capacity to adapt and survive. They talked about the importance of international law and the Geneva Convention, how rules could protect people even in the worst circumstances. They talked about the individuals who made choices to be humane, when inhumanity would have been easier. Their story became part of the historical record, a small but significant testimony to the complexity of war and the possibility of mercy even in conflict. Students studied their accounts, trying to understand how nations convinced entire populations to hate and fear each other, and how those hatreds could be overcome through direct human contact. When Emiko passed away at the age of 86, her funeral was attended by family, friends, and former colleagues from both Japan and America. Former Lieutenant Hayes, now in her 90s, sent a wreath and a letter that was read at the service. It spoke of a young nurse who had expected death and received life, who had turned trauma into purpose, who had built bridges between former enemies. Chio lived to 92, teaching almost until the very end. Her school erected a memorial in her honor, celebrating her dedication to peace education and international understanding. The inscription read, "She taught us that the enemy is human, and that lesson changed everything." Haruko lived the longest of the three, passing just shy of her 100th birthday. She had spent over 50 years as a nurse, treating tens of thousands of patients. At her memorial service, a former patient spoke about how Haruko had once told him, "I learned mercy from my enemies. They taught me that even in war we can choose kindness. I have tried to honor that lesson every day of my life." Their story, the story of Japanese women POWs who could not believe their first day in America, became a testament to the power of humane treatment and the danger of dehumanizing propaganda. It showed that expectations shaped by hatred could be shattered by simple acts of dignity and respect. It also revealed an uncomfortable truth, that people are capable of believing terrible lies about their enemies, and that governments will use those lies to prosecute wars. But it offered hope as well, hope that direct contact, that seeing the individual rather than the stereotype, could overcome even the most deeply ingrained prejudice. The three women had boarded that transport ship expecting to meet demons. Instead, they met people, flawed people certainly, people living in a nation that was itself flawed and capable of great injustice, but people who, in that specific context, chose to follow rules, to provide care, to treat prisoners with basic humanity. That choice made all the difference. It did not erase the war or the suffering. It did not justify the violence or excuse the atrocities. But it created a small space where enemies could see each other as human beings. And in that space, transformation became possible. Their legacy lives on in the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who grew up hearing these stories. It lives on in the educational programs that use their testimony to teach about the importance of international humanitarian law. It lives on in the ongoing efforts to build understanding between former enemies. The story of Emiko, Chio, and Haruko is a story about expectations shattered, about propaganda exposed, about the resilience of the human spirit. It is a story about the first day in America, when everything they believed was challenged by the simple reality of humane treatment. It is a story that reminds us that even in our darkest moments, even when nations are at war and hatred seems insurmountable, individuals can choose mercy. And those choices, multiplied across millions of interactions, can change the world. So if you found this story of unexpected humanity moving, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more incredible true stories from history. Drop a like if you believe mercy matters even in the darkest times. And leave a comment below. What would you have thought in their position? Could you have trusted kindness from your enemy? Let's talk about it.